how did you actually pivot to data, and then what were your starting steps into security?
The last interview that I did, I interviewed this individual who was talking about using social media and information that people posted online to get people fired from jobs or to go after people. The people who would be best at social engineering are not going to be people who have like college degrees or anything like that. It's going to be people who've done sales. One of the things that I just wanted to mention to you and your viewers, and I'm going to be sharing this with my viewers as well. I think that if you think about security and data and just development in general, there's four big stories. My point earlier about security, when people ask me, so like what tools should I use or what classes? And again, in terms of classes, you do have some colleges. I know we have, probably you have as many users as I have all over the world. You have like things like Udemy, you have things like Pluralsight, you have a great deal of learning platforms. But overall, the way that I like to see it is like the big picture of data. The question is, can we actually secure data?
Thanks, Tim. Actually, thanks for accepting to do this interview. I really appreciate it because, how often you say hi to strangers, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah. So I actually, I followed Tim's YouTube channel, SQLInSix Minutes. Interesting name. I love it. He mostly talks about T-SQL, data security, and he is into ETL, data engineering, basically a data professional. So, and he had a very interesting perspective on big data and security around it. We'll talk about that. And now actually, Tim, if you could just give a 2-minute intro of yourself, that'll be great.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on. And I checked out your YouTube channel as well, and I was like, this is really fascinating in some of your interviews and stuff. So I always like to see Oracle demos as well. Those are really useful because it's different perspectives. So yeah, just a little bit about myself, and I've worked in the technology field for quite some time. I got my start really early. My parents believed, I was homeschooled in elementary, and they believed that technology was going to be big. So they wanted us to be familiar with computers. And then later I went to private school. And there was a private tutor that I worked with at private school who was, she realized that I didn't really learn by like reading. She was like, you're more hands-on. And so it was kind of like pseudo coding back in the day, but creating your own little demo things. And then in high school, I went to a public high school. And in the public high school, I had a great teacher who just handed me a book on HTML, said, teach yourself HTML, we need a website. And so I learned very quickly how quickly you could teach yourself things. And then, of course, in college, I studied information systems and got into the data field and predominantly do things like data engineering, extract, transform, and load. And then, as you probably have seen with all these leaks of data, security became a big part of that. And so that's just a brief overview of my background. And then I do the YouTube channel mainly because the very beginning, I was trying to remember things that I was learning, because I don't know if you ever go through this, but you solve a problem and then you forget how you solved that problem because you're solving so many different problems. And so the more difficult things I wanted to remember, and that was the beginning of it. And then from there, it just kind of expanded out.
Yeah, it's awesome actually. I think maybe it's I think it's worth talking about just having some sort of outlet. Like everyone, this is my opinion. Like everyone has a lot of knowledge, and they should like share it with the world. And if they have a blog or YouTube, just talking about what they know, that will definitely make the world a better place. That's my opinion.
Yeah. That's very true. It's very true.
Yeah, I was talking to another person, the person that I interviewed before. He has a channel called Intricity, and he talked about the same thing. Basically, he wanted like a place to save all his knowledge and then be able to explain things in a simple way. Because it's not, even though you can do certain things, it's not the same thing. Explaining that and doing that is two different things actually.
Yeah, and some of the data videos that I record, like to your point, sometimes I'll record things that I'm like, this is going to be valuable, like let's say 20 years later, and it's knowledge that I wish that I had. And so like, like with kids, like I would love my kids to know that, to pass it down to them. So yeah, the data videos are a little bit different on my channel than like, let's say the actual coding. Because I mean, like T-SQL, PowerShell, all that, I mean, 20 years probably not going to exist. There'll be something cooler, right? But the like the fundamentals of like, let's say the assumptions behind data being more important than actual data, that those are truths that are, those have been true, 1,000 years ago, and they're still true today. So there's some stuff on the channel that, will stand the test of time, but then some stuff is, in time is going to be,
Yeah.
we're not going to be using those languages and stuff.
Yeah.
It's funny when you think about that.
Yeah, I guess going back to your, you starting to get interested in technology, taught yourself HTML. I kind of like, I don't know, in Indians basically take two routes. It's doctor or medicine or engineering, So I actually, and the bar for getting into medicine is really high in India. And then, and even here, I'm pretty sure MCAT is very difficult. But then, but yeah, but I was actually pretty good at computers. That's actually, I took some basic courses, and that's how I went. And then, but I'm curious, like after your information systems, right? That's what you said. That's your bachelor's, I believe, major.
Yep.
And after that, actually, you got into consulting. Actually, is that right? Or you went for higher studies?
So I worked for quite a few companies actually once I got from the information systems. The difference is that I also consulted on the side. Now in the United States, as you probably know, like you can't ever consult with a company that's a competitor. So let's say you work like in the financial field, you might consult with a healthcare company as long as there's no conflict of interest. So I would consult with, a lot of times it was like if I was in the financial industry, I would consult with like, let's say healthcare, or if I was in healthcare, I would consult with like education. But it was always and sometimes it was just individuals, but it was a non-competitor or whatnot. And then I do the security focus that I do is just social engineering. It's not any of the technical thing. As you probably know, cybersecurity is very deep, and social engineering is more the social side of that. And none of it is digital social engineering, which is like social media. This is like in-person social engineering. And so that kind of gave me an outlet as well, because in college, while I was studying information system, I did sales. And so there's an element of sales that I miss just because you interact with customers all day long. And so some of the social engineering is it's kind of like that again. In fact, there's some principles that actually overlap, like building trust, that kind of stuff. And you're doing it for a good reason. You're not social engineering to manipulate companies. You're doing it to show people, okay, this is what somebody would do if they were trying to get into your company this route, right? And but yeah, I missed that in college in a way that I enjoy working in tech, but one of the things I don't like about tech is, what is it? It's always about who's right and who gets their idea, and it's where sales is more about learning to get along with people and building something together. It's a little bit different perspective. So I enjoy working with technical people, but after a while, it's like, okay, I need to go out there and work with the salespeople or whatever, like work on that side of things. So I have to get my extrovert out as well. Some of the technical stuff could be too much introverted. I don't know if you feel the same way, but that's how I am. So.
Yeah, I mean, people are different, right? Like I definitely like some time to focus, but I'm actually now becoming more and more open, in the sense I used to hate meetings. Now I see that as a platform to connect with my team and anyone who's on the meeting, basically. And these interviews actually, they kind of like bring me out of my shell. I tend more towards like reading, spending more time in private. You got interested in security. What were sort of like, that's not the first thing you go towards, when you start working. People get into development or whatever. So first of all, you were into information systems. How did you actually pivot to data? And then what were your starting steps and into security?
The route that I got into both was, and data was first, is in college while I was studying information systems and I was doing sales on the side, I was collecting demographic information. And one of my what was it in college? What I thought about doing was marketing, and so I was collecting that information to kind of uh, basically provide marketing ideas for various demographics. And it was good information, but one of the challenges I faced very early was scale. I think like the very first project that I was doing was in Excel. And yeah, once you get enough data points, this is no longer efficient to be querying data. And so that was my initial interest. And I wrote this site on demographics for a while. And what got me into security while I was interested in data, and that's kind of how I was pivoting to information systems, was that blog that I used to write, I interviewed various people in different fields. The last interview that I did, I interviewed this individual who was talking about using social media and information that people posted online to get people fired from jobs or to go after people if this person disagreed with them. And they were trying to coordinate movements. And I thought to myself, like, this is very dangerous. Like, this is not a smart thing at all. And that's actually why I shut down that site, is I realized that, okay, so maybe some of this is going a different route. When I was in high school, I don't know about you, but my thought of the internet was it's this global source of information. That's how people are going to use it. But some of the internet has been used for very different things than I initially expected. And I can't say that some of those things are improvements at all. And so that was the first, I would say, like kind of toe that I dipped into security. Like, so how do you secure your information? Because there are people out there that are like this. I mean, it would be, and keep in mind, this person wouldn't consider themselves a hacker. They would just consider themselves a person who they have a specific belief, and anybody who disagrees with their belief, they want to go after, right? And so that was how I started down that route. I'm in the same in the same route as I was going around data. I realized that like when I collect data, like in terms of demographics, it's making sure I'm not collecting any data that's personally identifiable, right? Like, so if that data were ever compromised, nobody would know who I had a conversation with, right? Um, but it's because, like, I mean, I may disagree with people, but I'm not going to go after them on social media, or like,
Yeah.
that's just, to me, that's very unethical.
Yeah.
And this person, they thought that this was, this is what you do with someone's data. And I don't know, for me, I was very disturbed.
Yeah, that's bizarre even to hear it. Actually, I can see why companies would do that, like before hiring you. Like they want to make sure, this person is not, I don't know, he's sort of ethical in some ways. They can probably look at your Facebook posts and LinkedIn posts, and then if you're like wild or whatever, then basically they might use that information to in the selection process. But to just because like someone disagrees with you, you start collecting the personal data, it's public, and then you go after them. Like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get you fired if you don't
And
disagree.
even to your point about like companies collecting data,
Yeah,
like, and the person's wild or something.
yeah,
But I mean, people do, this is my viewpoint. It's like people change over time. So I can't really judge someone, let's say, by what they did when they were 18, right? Like, but they're not, let's say I'm hiring them at 27, but that's 9 years difference, right? And
yeah,
so even then, like, people do change in time. So it's kind of hard to say, but it was disturbing. And needless to say, that's kind of, as I was collecting data, and then I was doing these interviews with people who are, experts. And this individual, was an author of a book. I'm not revealing the person, but I was very disturbed by like how much like say this person had, and how much this person was like, yeah, we're actively doing this. And what's crazy about that is I think it was like 7 or 8 years later. Have you heard of the term swatting?
no. What is it?
So swatting is when what happens is, let's say somebody doesn't like somebody over live stream or over the internet, like YouTube Live. What they'll do is they'll call in the authorities. They'll call them the authorities on them, I should say. And like a SWAT team will show up thinking that they're about to do something bad, even though there's nothing wrong going on. But this is a thing that actually occurs in the United States. So just to let you know, never do a YouTube Live thing, because it like stores information, unfortunately. But there was actually a person who was killed in a swatting
Oh.
incident.
Mm.
Like somebody, they disagreed with each other. the person called basically the authorities on this person. The SWAT team showed up thinking this person was a terrorist. They weren't. They were just, playing a video game or something online, and they ended up getting killed. And this is the effect potentially of somebody who believes, well, I disagree with this person, therefore I'm going to go after them. It could result in something like that. So that, to me, just understanding the importance of, okay, so if we have data, are we keeping these data secure? Are we making sure that we're not compromising people in any way? And then you've seen all the leaks, which is just crazy.
So you're more interested in personal data than corporate data, or I guess like corporate data is your day job, and then protecting personal data, that's your passion. Is that right?
I don't know if I would say passion, but like it's definitely an interest.
Mm-hmm.
As far as corporate data, like, yeah, working with corporate data or business data in
Business
terms of,
data, yeah.
yeah, in terms of like analysis or whatnot. Like you at Salesforce, I don't know how much of your job is like, let's say, writing queries or building the structure around queries, but it's similar to that.
Mm.
Yeah, it's just, yeah, it can be any whatever data they provide. We have to,
Mm.
build the appropriate structure and write appropriate queries for those.
So are these examples that you mentioned, are they like one-off examples, or basically you see a lot of it? Like, you talked about this incident where this author, he wanted to sort of like attack people in a way, and then yeah, so are these like one-off cases, or like is that a common thing that you see nowadays?
Well, that's a great question, because the problem, as you probably have observed as well, is like, so that was over a decade ago that I had that interview. So that's a while ago, right? Um, there's been almost more radicalization because people disagree with each other now over various things. Like my grandparents, I grew up, I don't know if your grandparents or parents told you this, but my grandparents always told me, you don't ever discuss religion and politics, right? But if you think about most social media, it feels like nowadays that's all you hear about. And I'm not on Facebook, and I do not get on Twitter anymore. That was one of the great things with, I call it he who cannot be named, which has happened in the last year. So you can probably figure out what that is. But is I got off those platforms because this is very divisive. But when people get divisive like that, they believe that whatever they're doing is, what is it? They rationalize it basically. I can do anything to people I disagree with. So I can see why my grandparents said that, like, really stay away from divisive topics. And to be fair, it's not just religion and politics. I don't know if you've ever observed this, but like the nutrition community, like paleo versus carb versus keto, all that, those people can get really passionate about their stuff to the point that it's like those people recommending carbs are bad, and it's a little crazy. But so to your question, as far as have I observed it's gotten worse, definitely in some places. I feel like people in their disagreement more, they're willing to compromise others. And I know, at least just because I have friends of all part of the different perspectives of different things, at least in the last 3 or 4 months, there was some other leak that occurred because someone didn't like a group of people. And so they went out and leaked the data. But yeah,
Uh,
it's because we have hackers as well. And then hackers have their own agenda, and they can leverage off of some of these like leaks, right? So I'm sure you've seen, just it seems like in our industry, it's one hack after another.
mm. Okay, so did you actually do any certifications in cybersecurity, or how did you actually sort of like prepare yourself? Like, where did you go from there? So you got all these experiences, you interviewed people for your blog, and you kind of got concerned, and then where did you go from there actually?
Yeah, so if you let's start with the what is it, the certification. So if you are doing cybersecurity on the technical side, you will probably find that a lot of the places that hire you are going to expect either some type of certifications, a degree. Like cybersecurity has become a really hot degree, actually, and there's various ways like penetration testing, etc. If you're doing the social engineering side, you might have that focus. That's a really good question, because this is just my opinion, But if you do contracting with clients like I do, you're probably going to find that the people who would be best at social engineering are not going to be people who have like college degrees or anything like that. It's going to be people who've done sales. Because again, they know a lot about, there's a lot of elements to social engineering. You know, sales people are all about you build trust. Um, and so that's going to be a huge principle. So it depends. Like if you're doing social engineering like over the web, you're probably going to again go more of the degree or certification route. But if it's in person, and especially nowadays, it's crazy just what's happened with colleges. I've been stunned, but like you really have to have a lot of experience, like interacting with people face to face, and also persuasion, right? And really, the path that teaches you that the best is sales. Now, as far as the data side, let's talk about data. Um, I think similar to you, and correct me if I'm wrong. I started more as a DBA, a database administrator, and then did a lot of heavy development. And I don't know if I guess it's kind of similar with Oracle, but for me, I was always frustrated with DBA tools just in general because they weren't well developed. And so part of what allowed me to pivot around in it was while I was being a database administrator, I was always building my own tools for solving problems. And so, but as a DBA, and you know this, like one of the big concerns is if you're storing people's information, that information gets leaked, right? There's a hacker that gets in and leaks that information. And so, um, one of the things that I just wanted to mention to you and your viewers, and I'm going to be sharing this with my viewers as well. I think that if you think about security and data and just development in general, there's four big stories to think about, and there's a deep dive that all of our viewers could look at with these. The first one is the Equifax data breach. If you remember that one, that is an example of we're a system that we're all supposed to be a part of, this credit system, right? And our data gets leaked. Okay, so that's one of those examples. And then you probably remember the Spectre and Meltdown. Those are the vulnerabilities, right? Those are examples of, or that example, I should say, is an example of a vulnerability that existed in hardware for a long period of time that people didn't know about. And all of a sudden they discovered. And to this day, we don't even know if anybody ever used that. Like we can't, because you know, a hacker's dream fundamentally is to get into a system and nobody ever knows that they were in there, right? To get in and get out. Like they don't want to stay in. And then another one was the Exactus data breach, if you remember that one. That was, I believe it was a researcher that discovered a vulnerability with Exactus. We don't think hackers got the data, but they may have. But that's an example of where you have a company that is, they're so focused on short-term profit that they're not thinking about the potential downside of what they're storing, right? And then the recent one, of course, is SolarWinds. And that's one where, again, as a DBA, a former DBA, and I'm sure you know this well, we're using a tool and it turns out the tool is compromised. So even though, let's say, we were both doing a good job managing security in our environment, but then it turns out that a tool that we're using
Yeah,
is compromised.
it's one central
Nightmare.
location from which you can access all your all the company's data, actually, right?
Exactly. And so those four, and again, there have been other breaches, there have been other vulnerabilities, but I feel like those four for our audiences are good examples of how we think about how we're building the world, right? Like we're building a world where everybody is forced to participate in the system. That would be the credit one. But if we can't secure people's data, we have to start asking, is that a good idea? Whether it's short-term profit, that's the Exactus one, vulnerabilities that we may not know exist. And then of course, tools that we may use to hopefully secure us more and hopefully monitor things to improve the systems. And then it turns out those are vulnerable. So for me, viewing that, thinking about, okay, so what are we building in data, right? And if we can't secure these as well as we think we can, maybe we need to rethink what we're doing with data. Maybe there are some things that, I don't know if you've ever heard this quote, but it's by G.K. Chesterton, where he says, art is limitation. The essence of every picture is the frame. And my viewpoint is like with data, maybe we should think about maybe limiting the scope. Okay, so maybe we shouldn't store some data, right? Like, or maybe we should pass it off to the user can store it, but we're simply the transmitter and we just keep that secure, but we're not going to actively store their data.
Yeah, that's a good point. Um, so what are some things, actually? I think we have two two category of folks. One is actually people who are watching the interview and they're like, they definitely agree with the fact that data security, definitely personal data security is important. On the other side, you were talking about business data. So what are some uh, skills that people can develop to get into security related jobs like data security? Like what skills do they need to build to get into that kind of domain?
That's a good question as far as like if you want to approach security from solely a data perspective, like the technical side.
Are there
Uh,
any tools actually like that's very popular? I know people sort of like SOX audit. That is actually a common auditing sort of like a company policy that people use SOX for auditing all their uh, data, and then making sure like this data is exposed here, so we need to control that. So is that like something that they could go into, or do you have a different perspective there actually?
yeah, for somebody beginning, and this would just be security in general.
Yeah.
I would look. I think it's, and I may say this wrong, but I think it's OWASP, and it deals with cybersecurity in general. That's a good starting point, and they, and I'm going from memory here. It's been a while since I've looked at their site, but if I recall correctly, they link to some useful tools, and I can provide more information afterwards. But I think I actually just shoot you some links. But um, if you're looking like at tooling, as far as like learning, so it is true. It would be kind of difficult to connect the dot. Like if you're taking a beginner, let's say, and you're trying to teach them why potentially storing data on people could be a problem in a hacker. Like if you think about, let's, you've heard of IoT, for instance. There's a lot of people that think IoT is great, right? But let's think about IoT from the perspective of if a hacker compromised your stuff, right? It's really hard for me to believe that anyone thinks the entire industry is a good idea. Like I cannot think of a single positive argument in favor of IoT. Everything I've heard is that's more dangerous than it is good, right? Like if I hear someone say, oh, well, you're at work and you turn on your thermometer or your thermostat and you adjust the temperature so when you get home, it's cool. And it's like,
It sounds cool actually. Hey,
for
look
me,
at
it's
this,
like,
and clap, and it gets the
yeah.
lights on, my coffee machine, whatever.
See, to me, it's just crazy. It's like that means that, potentially if that's compromised, a hacker could just have a
Yeah.
heyday with your house. And so it's not worth it. So it's like, how would you go about teaching someone, like on the case of data? So let's say we're storing data for marketing purposes. Let's just throw it out there, kind of like Exactus. And we're storing all these details about them to the point that we can identify, like our browser has all these details that's basically tracking about us to the point we can identify the specific individual. So yeah, how do you go about teaching someone, but what's the potential problem with doing that, right? And to your point, like when did you learn, like what you said earlier, when did you learn not to post so much stuff to Facebook, right?
Yeah.
You almost have to experience that. And in fact, I used to joke around that the best way to learn security was to, this is back in the day though, but was to buy Bitcoin, right? And the reason why is because there is a high probability that you would get hacked. And that's just how the Bitcoin community is. It's just like hackers love to target the Bitcoin community. Like if you've heard of SIM swaps, those were so targeted at Bitcoiners for a long time, because they would just go after them that way. And so it's like a person really has to kind of experience, and not kind of, but they have to experience the effects of poor security in order to appreciate good security.
Yeah.
And it's like, to your point, you had to experience what is it, what could potentially happen that's wrong if you overshared something to Facebook in
Yeah.
order for you to learn that. So it sounds tough, but it's like, unless college or unless the certification or unless the course, and it could be nowadays, there's all these courses. You can go to Udemy and learn penetration testing. You can go to what is it, Pluralsight, and learn it. You can go to all these different sites, not just college, not just certifications anymore. But the problem is, without really almost experiencing something like that, it's very hard to see, okay, so why should I not approach a problem that way, right?
Yeah.
And that is where I feel like in just education in general. And hey, my YouTube channel is just as guilty, because I'm like you. I use the internet for information. I don't use it because I'm not hanging out with people online. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. But how do you go about teaching people through experience, right? They have to actually go through that experience, and that's hard.
Yeah.
um, if you, by the way, if you ever figure out a solution to that problem, let me know. It's just like, hey, I would love to hear that, so
Yeah.
but go ahead.
Me, actually, like I said, I got that experience long time ago, so that was a good experience. And apart from that, I have all these corporate trainings which are helpful to help me identify sort of like the points of contact actually with this potential hackers. Like my email, like if I'm nowadays it's not a problem, but if I'm on my on BART, uh, here in California, if I'm like working, I need to be careful about protecting my information. If I'm actually yes, making sure my laptop's safe, like put it in a place where it's not accessible to public. Those kinds of things are useful when it comes to protecting myself. And with respect to my company's data, business data, it's always about what is the personal information that we are storing. Let's actually identify that first, actually. Is it the emails, phone numbers, address, those kinds of things, and where in our uh, data, basically in our databases, do we have this data? And then now let's actually make sure the database is behind many firewalls, first of all, that's to make sure actually it's not reachable. That's the main thing, right? So we used to rely on network security a lot. Nowadays, it's actually uh, you have two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, that kind of thing, to basically stop people from getting there. And then apart from that, actually, the data that trickles down to development test stage databases. So that data is actually, we're very careful about. I used to be very careful about that, in the sense I don't work in that domain anymore. I actually am sort of moved away into DevOps and all that. But that is actually one area that I worked on, with regards to security, like making sure all this personal information is masked in non-production, which are less secure than production. So that is something that I used to do.
Now, did you
What
hear,
else?
I'm curious, since you do some DevOps, did you hear about the one of the tools involved in the SolarWinds that's usually a preferred tool in DevOps, TeamCity? Did you hear about that?
I did.
Yeah.
I don't use SolarWinds now, but I worked for another company. Uh, I don't know if I can name it, but they use SolarWinds actually, uh, and they use it for monitoring SQL Server databases, and because for Oracle you have other tools, like, but for SQL Server actually, especially this is, I don't know if you've seen this. If you are an expert in one tool or one database, let's say I'm an expert in Oracle, but these days you end up working on many different kinds of databases.
Yep.
So now all of a sudden you have to manage a different one,
Yep.
or work with a different one. And but although the concepts are pretty much the same across, let's say, relational databases like Oracle and SQL Server, you can actually you can say, okay, if you understand Oracle, then you can get to the basics of SQL, or understand the basics of SQL Server pretty quickly.
Yep.
But then, you want all these tools, like especially like SolarWinds kind of actually, it makes it a no-brainer for you. Like, I want top 10 SQL. I don't want to know how to get top 10 SQL, worst performing SQLs actually. Like, SolarWinds actually was useful in that way, right? Regardless of what kind of database is behind, uh, if I could actually just go to SolarWinds and find what logs are there, what I want to find like bad SQLs, and that's all. So we used to use that tool for that purpose. But then, what you're saying is true actually. That if they get that, now you have like super user access to all your databases. Now you can like you have all the data. Uh, yeah, that
Yeah,
that
to your point earlier, I mean, so there's general practices for securing environments, like a lot of the stuff that you mentioned. You don't keep PII data in dev, right? You try to isolate the way that a lot of companies, not all, but a lot of companies try to approach even PII data in prod is that it's very hunkered down. So it may only be in like one database. The thing about it, and I recommend our viewers, all of your viewers and my viewers, that they watch the documentary 0 Days or 0 Day. I think it's by one of the Washington D.C. guys, but it's on Stuxnet, right?
what is it
And the
again?
reason why that, so go ahead.
What's the name again? The documentary
0
name?
Days. Yeah, it's on Amazon, and I think it's on. You can even buy it on YouTube. I think it's now on
Viewer
YouTube.
days.
0 Days.
0 days.
Yes.
Okay.
And so the first guy, the director's name is Alex, I think, Gibney. I'm going from memory, but he interviews all these experts in the field. And so this is my point earlier about security. When people ask me, so like, what tools should I use or what classes? And again, in terms of classes, you do have some colleges. I know you have as many users as I have all over the world. You have like things like Udemy, you have things like Pluralsight, you have a great deal of learning platforms. But overall, the way that I like to see it is like the big picture of data. The question is, can we actually secure data? And the reason why I highlight that documentary is some of the military guys that are interviewed in that documentary, one of the guys especially, I love what he says. He's like, this was after Buckshot Yankee, which was a compromise of the US military. He points out, he's like, we came to the conclusion that we could never secure our system. He's like, no matter how much we hardened it, we couldn't actually secure it. And there's another interview with a Symantec guy, like a Norton Symantec, and Eric Chin, I believe is his name. And he says, he's talking about air gap networks, which for the record, in the Bitcoin community, there's this myth that if you keep your Bitcoins on an air gap machine, it's safe. But Eric Chin, and he correctly points this out, is there's no such thing as an air gap machine. Like hackers have all kinds of ways to get into an air gap machine. And if they really want to go after you, they can get into, that machine that's not connected to the internet. Now, my point would be like, even if I built the best database security in the world, I had it all firewalled off, like nobody could get access. There's one port into it, et cetera, right? Like, let's say we did the best job in the world. Well, if hackers can break in to an air gap machine, if somebody wants those data, they're going to be able to find a way in, right? And that's why on my YouTube channel, I have one of the videos is who attacks and why, who hacks and why. One of the reasons why I talk about different levels hackers is that design may keep out script kiddies or amateur hackers, but that's not going to be able to keep out the more sophisticated attackers. And so that's where the bigger picture comes down to, should we be storing certain information if we consider the fact that we can't promise our users that we can secure their data, right? And like, since you're a former DBA and I'm a former DBA, my viewpoint, be interesting to hear your viewpoint on this too as well, but if I can't absolutely promise my users security, then some of their data I should never be storing, because I don't find, or at least I should store it with the context of letting them know, first of all, it's optional. And second of all, we cannot provide 100% security, right? We just can't, right? This digital systems are not 100% secure. I don't know, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on that as a former DBA. What would you say?
Yeah, it's interesting because first of all, people don't take that much time understanding what they're sharing with the applications that they're using. Yep. Right? And you use Facebook to authenticate so many sites, you even forget actually. I agree, but then I guess if they said that aloud, they will lose a lot of money because they, like Google, they rely on data. and Facebook, they rely, their revenue depends on user data. So yeah, I think they are doing their best, but I can understand where you're coming from. I agree with you, but then the ethical standpoint is one thing, and then the business. So they have to look at that, and maybe like being honest with the customers, that might bring more customers. But in my experience, that's backfired actually. Uh, in the sense that I used to work for StubHub, and then at one point they tried something like, what is it? Uh, it was a feature that basically showed all the pricing details. Like, like when you're like browsing for tickets, nowadays there's no live events. Uh, but then those days, actually, when people used to go to concerts and sports and stuff like that, um, when you're browsing for tickets, buying tickets, you see one price, but then when you get to the last page, when you need to pay, you end up paying like maybe $50 more or whatever. They actually tried basically displaying all that charges, all the, then it kind of backfired. The revenue went down for them because of that feature. Um, and then they ended up actually reverting it. The point I'm trying to get at is, if companies are more honest about how they are securing customers' data, I am thinking that might backfire in terms of their revenue, actually, which is why they don't share. They're not that transparent about it.
Yeah, so that's a good thing. That's a good point to make. I would just, this is my 3 sentence answer to that would be, so you had originally reached out about like data and data science. And one of the things you probably remember I told you is like, there's this myth that if we have more data, if we have more accurate predictions on data, we'll do better. But the Soviet Union actually contradicts that, right? The Soviet Union was the most educated society, or one of the most educated societies in human history. And they had data on everything, and yet they collapsed, right? They didn't go anywhere. And not only that, Russia has more natural resources than any country on the planet. They should have dominated the world. So there's an assumption. By the way, I made this assumption too. Gosh, I was so wrong when I was younger. Like, if you have more data, you'll be able to do better things. But actually, I've learned that you don't really need that much data to actually be really successful in business. And so there is this assumption, if we store more data, we'll be able to do better. But if we have all these data leaks, the counterpoint to that is, for one, there's going to be some cost. We may lose trust from people. That's a big cost. There may be bureaucrats that come in and say, hey, we want more regulation, right? That's another cost. And so actually it could be the opposite way around, right? So to me, there's got to be a balance. And the balance starts with, so what data, like just asking you this as a former DBA and myself, like what data would we be okay with potentially being leaked about ourselves? And if the answer is, well, not this, but if people know, like, okay, so he wore a blue shirt in this interview and he wore, a maroon shirt, I'm going with my screen there, like, that's perfectly fine. Like, to your point earlier, you try to do things in interview where you reveal as little of details about you. That's a smart thing, right? But there might be things about yourself that you don't want, people to know, and thus, it's like protecting people's information that way. So that's how I view it too, because I agree with you. Like, companies do have to make money. If they can't make money, then they're just burning resources.
Yeah.
But the question is, are we doing that in a way that potentially puts people's information at risk? Like, that's the difference between, in my opinion, Exactus, the marketing company, if we're just going to collect everybody's as much information as possible, versus the company that's marketing on the basis of, well, what do we generally know about how people mature through life? We're not collecting personal information. We're understanding the natural route that people are going to take through their life. Okay, they typically, go to college here. They typically do these things. And in my opinion, like, patterns are more accurate than like specific nuances, unless you're selling like a product like peanut butter or something like that, where you really need to know that, that client. But there's ways to know those clients without, storing their personal information too. So
Yeah.
that's the counterpoint. And I agree with you that, again, businesses do have to be profitable. You can't just be giving them free money all the time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I have an interesting take on, I guess interesting to me at least, on data science. I don't think things are that predictable, you know, no matter how much data you collect, there's always going to be some percentage of uncertainty. Yes, we have gotten better with respect to recommendations and things like that. Like, those are really helpful. You can argue actually, like, helpful to the company. Like, for example, YouTube makes good recommendations, so you will be on their site longer, on YouTube longer. Uh, but you might like it because now, you're seeing all the interesting videos, or the videos that you might be interested in. And same with Amazon. I agree uh, with the use case, the recommendations use case. But then, another example where people try to use data to improve their business is pricing, actually, right? They want to price their products perfectly based on the data. And I don't think people are successful, like, at all, like, no matter how much work and effort they put into it. The basic point being, actually, machine learning, data science, I think they are all like buzzwords in a way, to me. And uh, and those are things, that shiny objects that industry is going towards, but
Yeah.
the basics of business are still the same. You basically try things out and and figure out what's working for you. And there's no certainty at all. So that's my opinion. No matter how many data scientists you hire, how much data you collect, there's no certainty at all in life. Like COVID, who knew about COVID? Yeah.
Yeah, and then to your point, like with the data, then you have to be concerned with if you have people's data, like securing it, because that may end up being a bigger concern, and depending on what happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think AI, what is it, data science, all that AI, especially, I have a very boring opinion of it. I think it's going to do some good things, but I don't think it's going to be this fantastic. The technology that I've still been most excited about, that I think has a lot of application, is 3D printing. I it's transforming the physical world. And just seeing, I don't know if you've ever been to China and just see how they apply 3D printing, because the US is behind. China
Yeah.
leads the world in 3D
Yeah.
printing, but it's just crazy what they're doing. And I mean, we can argue, like we could discuss data science or AI, like what it's going to do. Like some people think it's going to destroy the world or whatever, or maybe it's just going to lead to better movie recommendations. You have those opposite extremes. But nobody can argue when you see a building being 3D printed in a day and you're like, what? Like it's just amazing to see this. And this happens in China. I mean, they are so advanced in it. And my friend, what was one of my friends was telling me that we have more aircraft carriers than China does. Like we'll always be more powerful. And I'm like, dude, China could 3D print all the aircraft carriers they need in a year, and they would outnumber us. They know that those are irrelevant. That's why they don't, build a bunch of them, because they don't care.
Yeah.
But it's yeah, that to me is the technology of the 21st century, will probably be 3D printing. Yeah, and you highlight something that I think is important for all of our viewers, which is, we can't rely on companies to protect our security, because, they may be doing a good job, but a tool that they're using is compromised. It really comes down to us as individuals. And so my thing is, like, if it involves a lot of data to do business with a company, then I just opt out of doing business with them. And that's been kind of my new motto going forward.
Hmm.
I agree with you, though. I think the internet's useful for learning. So when it involves learning, that's great. But some of this expansive stuff into, what is it, digital money, or what is it, digital social relationships, or like, I've never understood social media that much in terms of that regard. It
Yeah.
starts to become more of a concern. But yeah,
Yeah.
you're right. It's the users that have to take their own security in their hands, for
Yeah.
sure.
Whenever you're putting your credit card information out there, don't save it. It takes maybe 5 minutes extra to enter the credit card. Don't authorize a payment platform like PayPal or whatever forever. Uh, right? You authorize once and forget about it. Then, like, then next time there's not even asking for password. You can, if account gets taken over, then they can just play with it, you know, they can, until you catch it. Yeah, those are a few things that I've picked up along the years,
That's good.
actually. Cool, Tim, actually. Thanks for this perspective. And then, especially in this day and age when big data, data science, and collecting a lot of data, this is all shiny objects, and people think of that as a good thing. And you highlighted a side of all these things which are of greater concern, actually. And it takes, if I think, like, if you're watching this interview, if you are working, it's better. You can actually, yeah, you can take this to your personal lives and then think about your own personal data security. And then, of course, you go to your company and then see where you can add value. Basically, you can say, okay, oh yeah, so this data is not secure, so let's actually do something about it. That kind of initiatives you can make as an individual. But that's thanks for all this useful information, and thanks for spending time on a Saturday to interview with me, sit and talk to me. It was a different interview than I expected, actually. It's usually technical. Okay, yeah, these are the skills, and this is how you go get a job. But today it's much different, and I think it's as important, actually. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so
You as
much.
well. Yep. Have a good one.